speak slowly. My Italian is good enough to follow what has been said, but not good enough to convey to you what I would like to say. My first impulse would, of course, be to engage with you in this wealth of data that you are presenting here. And I can assure you, and I hope that this is taken up by the media, is taken up in many, many parts of Italy as being of the highest interest. As you will see in my talk, at one point I speak about the imaginary layperson. The ideas that many researchers have about what the public is or what the laypersons are. And I think what you have done with the annuario is really to give it a much more concrete and evidence-based basis so that you can really find out who is the public or the publics and what are people actually thinking and saying, and especially if you do this over a period of 10 years, so congratulations. I have chosen to speak about a topic that is of general concern, namely how to communicate science, but also in times in which we are living now, the way how changes are also impacting on the way how we communicate science. And this is what I mean, and beyond. What I mean by this is the public engagement with science in times of austerity. What has changed in a time where funding for science, funding for certain parts of science is no longer to be taken for granted, where also the priorities of policymakers are shifting, but above all, that in society in general, we are living in a time where the future is shrinking. The future is becoming a notion that is much more fragile, much more volatile. If you think back, and many observers say the 70s were an exception, but if you think back at this exception, or just to cite one example, the study, the Club of Rome study that appeared in 1972, I had an occasion to read the peer reviews, because the study was financed by the Volkswagen. And they asked me at one point whether I could, for a celebration of the publication of the Club of Rome, go back and look at the peer review process, which I found extremely fascinating. And what I found there was that the persons who were for funding the study, they were all coming from the natural sciences, and the persons who were very cautious and recommended not to fund it were the political scientists. But the Volkswagen Foundation went ahead. But this was the occasion when I was also rereading this. I was rereading the study of the Club of Rome, and I was struck by the way how our notion of the future has changed. The future in that particular study was something that was to be avoided. So it was a scenario, what would happen if we are not more careful with our natural resources, etc. But there was this belief there is a future and we can shape it and we have to act in a particular way. And if you compare this with today, that our time horizon has become very, very small. And also the crisis, the original meaning of the crisis was a turning point, and now it has become a permanent condition. And of course, also the shifts in political priorities. So what does this mean for the way how science communicates with society, engages with society? On the one side, policymakers in particular are expecting miracles to be done by science. This is what I call the magical thinking. That science can solve all the problems, including job creation. It's just, you wave the magic wand and jobs can be created. On the other side, there is much more pressure to come up with short-term recipes, with short-term impact, and we see this a bit everywhere in Europe, the increase in audit cultures, the increase in what I call the impact cultures in the UK now. Before submitting your application for a research grant, you have to give a very detailed assessment of what the impact of your research will be. And while this can work in some parts, there are many parts of science where this is just not possible, because you don't know the impact, but also you want to come up with something that nobody has been thinking of before. You want to move into something that is not known as yet. You want to have the kind of surprises that you can control and that you know will be useful in the future. But then there are other problems. This is an interesting coincidence, 2 days from each other, on the cover page of two well-known journals, The Economist, but also the journal Nature. The issue, the top story, was dedicated to how science goes wrong, and Nature was writing about the peer review system going bust. How science goes wrong was an attack, criticism, but also an attack that there is a lot of misconduct going on in science in particular fields, especially in the biomedical field, but there are also problems and wrongdoings of science in a certain sense, that the results cannot be validated, they cannot be replicated, so there are problems.
Can you get the microphone closer?
Sorry. Because here I hear it differently from you. Here it's very loud. So this public image of science, as you can see in these two instances of journal stories, point to new tensions that were not in the forefront before. Within scientific circles, we have all been speaking about how long can the peer review system go on as it is, because it means more and more burden, etc., etc. But this has not been aired in public, and now it is out in the public, and it shows the tension is there. The replication crisis, John Ioannidis has written since many years, doing studies, how many studies in the biomedical field cannot be replicated. He has looked at the hype that comes. He has looked, for instance, in 200 articles, most cited articles that were promising very specific improvements for health. So not just a general claim, this will be good, very specific. And then he went back and he looked which one of these 100 had actually moved into a clinical trial period. And the result was below 5% of this 100. So there is now this call for relevance of scientific publication. On the one side, we see the pressure, especially on young people, publish in Science, Nature, Cell. So, and of course, Science, Nature, and Cell cannot take all the publications. So they diversify, there are more journals, but the question arises, how relevant are these publications to what you actually want to achieve? And the question, can science still control the quality? Because the original meaning of publication was in academies like this one. Scientists would speak about their results. You as the public would listen, you would believe what you've shown here as a demonstration. But the main point that has been validated and that is certified by the peers. And if this quality control is no longer able to maintain itself at a certain level, there will be more problems, and we can see some traces of this already now. So, like every crisis, I think it also presents opportunities to see if there are changes, what can we do better, what are new openings, maybe the new aperture that you were speaking of also comes in here. And I think one of the ways of entering here is to ask ourselves, what do we mean to call science a public good? And what is the value of science as a public good? What can we do to make this value the centerpiece again of why we do science? And this raises, among others, also the question, what is the place of people in our knowledge? And the place of people in some areas, it's obvious. In some areas, people enter as abstract numbers, as entities in an aggregate. And in some areas where you think they should be there, people, according to this Pew survey, say, why don't scientists care about people? So there is this disconnect that exists. And I think it would be worthwhile coming here. I was reading an article about plant biology and how plant biology involves people by having so many stakeholders to which their findings are of interest. There are the farmers, there are gardeners, there's the food industry, there's the energy industry, etc., etc. And involving some of these stakeholders, and it's not only industry, it's also ordinary people, creates new links with the public. But it is important also to reflect what is the place of people that we give people in the knowledge that we produce. Now, we have come quite a way in knowing how to communicate better. PUS stands for Public Understanding of Science, and the original idea was a rather naive one. Naive because it was based on the assumption if scientists inform the public, it's a bit of the old Enlightenment idea, but the world has changed. And the idea that if you just give information, people will become as excited about research as you are, they will accept what you tell them, and the problem will be solved. And this turned out to be a naive and a wrong assumption, because giving only more information does not change anything. Either people are not listening to the information and then get the answers that you were quoting, or information is just one other input in this information-saturated society in which you live. You get so much information from all sides, and scientific information is just one. So it does not change anything. Then we moved on to public awareness of science, and now we are calling it public engagement with science and with society. It's a two-way process. We also learned that the public does not exist. There are publics, and the view of various parts of the public are flexible. It depends how much people are concerned themselves. Not everyone has the same reason to be interested in, but then you have patient groups who can become extremely knowledgeable about the disease because they want to know, they want to be engaged. So you have to differentiate much more when you speak about the public. And then there is this study done by Albert Hirschman way back in the 70s. He was an economist, political scientist, and he was studying firms and organizations and states in what he thought was a phase of decline, and he was wondering, how does the public, the society respond? And he found 3 ways of how people respond. One he called exit, namely people leave. They leave the organization, they get disconnected from politics or from the state, or in other ways, this is what is called exit. The other option is voice. They protest, and you can raise your voice and be much louder and more aggressive, or you can do it in a softer way, but you articulate in various ways your criticism, your opposition, your frustration. And loyalty means you shut up and you stay. And this is something that I think is worthwhile to reflect again, that there are different choices that the publics have in responding to the way how science is approaching them and how they react to them. And then, of course, we also had to learn from the original enthusiastic taking up of the idea, yes, we should give people more voice, we should set up public dialogues, we should let them participate. And there have been many attempts in doing this, but to get to the point where these processes are taken up by the political process and really change things, this is a very stony road. This is not easy, and we have not gotten very far due to the way how our liberal democracies work, essentially. And then there is this idea, I call it the noble idea, of civic epistemologies, so a way to know and to apply this knowledge to politics. And Sheila Jasmine, a colleague of Massimiliano and myself and Barbara, has come up with this idea. It's a noble idea. But as I said, there is this gap between communication, between participation, having dialogues, engaging in a process of consultation even with citizens, and what follows from it. And we all are aware that science and politics still have a very tension-ridden relationship regardless of where you go. And in some parts of the world, especially in the UK, the evidence-based policy has come up as a way of bridging this tension between politics and science. Now, evidence-based policy is the idea that every policy should really be based on empirical facts that investigate what is actually happening, what are, to the extent that you can foresee, the impacts, what are the differences you see, etc. And as an idea, it's fine. But if you get to very concrete examples, questions arise: what kind of evidence is it? Whose evidence is it? In which context are you looking at it? And if it were so easy just to say these are the facts, then in Europe we would have only one policy. But whether you look at stem cells, or whether you look at biotechnologies, or at fracking, or whatever you take up, you will see the facts are, first of all, not so easy to ascertain, and it's not so easy to build a policy on them, because you have to take different contexts into account. You have to take into account that in one country you have a very liberal attitude, and in another country you have a very strict or even repressive attitude. So evidence policy meets its limits because it does not take context into account sufficiently. But there have been other interesting shifts recently, First, I would want to raise the question, who are the communicators? And here we have seen a professionalization of the field. Before, it was sort of the expectation was every scientist, every researcher should also communicate. Now, this meets some limits. Not everyone is gifted and talented. Not everyone wants to do it because it also is your research time, etc. So there are limits there, although the idea of communicating and that it is an obligation of every researcher to communicate, this has been accepted. But then, like playing the violin or the piano, even if we love the violin and the piano, not everyone is good at playing it in a concert. So there has been this professionalization of science communication, and we have seen, especially in well-endowed, to say, rich research organizations, compared to poor universities and poor research organizations, we have seen the rise of public information officers, as they are called, like you have an executive CEO, you have a technical CEO, etc. So now you have also public information officers. And on the other side, we see a demise in science journalism. The print media are in trouble everywhere in Europe, and the space, and of course the jobs in one of these print media for science journalism that is independent, that is critical, that is well known and well educated, this is going down. And therefore, you have on the one hand, we leave it up to research organizations to do the science communication in professional hands. You have the acceptance among researchers. Yes, we go out and we speak to citizens, at least from time to time. But there is something missing when we no longer have an independent science journalism. And then, of course, we have a change of the ecosystem of science communication with the new media. I was really surprised to hear your findings of how few, that there are people in Italy who have never used the internet. If you go to India, you know, you find one of these stands on every Indian road of people using the internet and so on. So anyway, so this ecosystem of the new media, I think, is changing the landscape. There are blogs, also many researchers now write blogs. It's a way of communicating which can be quite effective. And also YouTube is fantastic. You have TED Talks that are being translated into various languages now. So there are many more opportunities really to get this kind of information, communication, engagement with science. What is communicated? We find a trend towards breakthroughs and discoveries. This is what we like to convey. This is what we think the public is interested in. And there's nothing wrong with it, except that it leaves out some other parts that we are not communicating. Also, we put the emphasis on finished results and not so much on the process of reaching results. And then we emphasize, especially with kids, the aspect of fun and consumption. And again, there's nothing wrong with it, except at one point, you know, the kid discovers, if I want to study math, the fun part will take me up to a certain level, but then I have to sit down and really work hard. So, and these are aspects that are not communicated. And what I mean by this focus on spectacular results and discoveries is a bit what François Jacob called the day science versus the night science. The day science is where everything goes well. You have a successful lab, the researcher do the right things, the experiment works, everything is wonderful. But then it's the night science. The experiment does not work. You have to start all over again. Something has happened to your cell culture or whatever you were setting up. And both sides need to be communicated. And I also think that telling ordinary citizens that science is and research is a process with a lot of uncertainty in the process is a way of telling them much more than now we have had this spectacular breakthrough. So I'm pleading for shifting the attention and the emphasis more to the process than only on the result and the product. Then I find there's a growing importance of visualization, and I will come back to it. It's a new way of communicating. And there's also marginalization of the social sciences and of the humanities. I think partly because they find it difficult to use visualization and ways of presenting what they are doing. To whom are we communicating and with whom? Now, scientists have this fear that the young generation is no longer interested in science. Whether it's correct or not is another matter, but there is the fear. Science is a very competitive system, a high-performing system, and unless you can make sure that you have the young generation who is interested, you know, it is like a craft that may one day die out, that you want to prevent this at all costs. So then there is also the concern by policymakers with STEM disciplines, because we know there are probably not sufficient students in the STEM disciplines, so this gets again emphasis. And of course you want to interest the youngsters, and as was mentioned, there are festivals, there are science fairs, there are museums, there are science centers, but the question is there continuity of these spectacular and wonderful events? Who takes up the interest that has been generated? The kids come home, they want to discuss with their parents about what they have seen. The parents sort of are not very well equipped to take it much further. And so, I have to speak louder. I'm very sorry, because here it sounds very loud, so I have the impression that I'm speaking very loud. But I realize the acoustics is a different one. So the question with all these science fairs and festivals is what happens after the event is over. And who is there in the school in particular to take it on and to build on the interest that has been generated in children. And then there are citizens. Citizens, I mentioned this already, are often seen as imaginary laypersons, but the area is going to change this. And very often researchers think, well, you know, they are the beneficiaries. Whatever we do, it will be for the benefit of citizens, and we really believe it. But then, if you get into greater details, you find out that citizens have a very differentiated view of what they will benefit from. There are certainly aspects that everyone can benefit from, but then they can be, and there have been a number of empirical studies that acceptance is very nuanced and also very reasonable. And therefore, and what's most difficult, of course, is to anticipate future uses of new technologies, of new products. This is part of why it is so difficult to make any technological predictions. So there's a long list of predictions that went wrong. Not because you can extrapolate from a technological development, but what you cannot foresee is future uses. Who would have thought that the transistor in the radio would lead to completely different behavior. People would buy, because they now had a radio that they could take with themselves to the beach and in the car, etc. And so there are many of these examples. And then, in the way how we communicate, something that is also not appreciated or seen as much as it probably should is the political dimension. And by this I mean what in the literature is called the technopolitical imaginaries. Gabriel Echt has written on the French nuclear power and how it was set up. And as you know, the French are adamant in accepting nuclear power. And she makes it very clear why this is the case. So in all the opinion polls, even after Fukushima, the French believe in their nuclear power to be safe. After the Chernobyl disaster, there were studies made about the radioactivity spreading to Italy, and measurements were made in Sardinia, but they never came to Corsica, which is just, a little bit away, because for the French, this would have been a disturbing aspect. And this is what Gabriel Hecht calls the technopolitical imaginary. Or another example, my colleague in Vienna, Ulrike Feld, she has looked at why Austrians are very much against genetically modified organisms. And she relates it to the political imaginary of being a neutral country. And in a neutral country, you are free of wars, you are free of NATO, you are free of, anyone coming from the outside to disturb you. So with a genetically modified organism, then all of a sudden there are these genes that are coming into your field. And so there are these imaginaries, and it would be interesting to discuss, what are some of these technopolitical imaginaries, even if I agree with your assessment of having a very fragile scientific culture. So there are technopolitical imaginaries also in Italy that go some way to explain some basic attitudes that do not change that quickly. And then another aspect I want to mention here is, I call it mind the science gap. The experience of the life world is a very different one from what a researcher world looks like. And one of the first philosophers, Husserl, wrote about the crisis of European science in 1936. It's a famous book that philosophers know very well, but he wrote it under the impression in those years of the rise of fascism. He wrote it under the impression that there is this gap between science and the coming totalitarian political regimes, and science not being able to use all the rational arguments that you can have. So it was a sort of impotence of science exposed to this political threat of totalitarianism. And he developed his arguments about the life world, saying, well, this is a different way of looking, utilizing the senses. It's different kind of evidence that counts. It's everyday forms of cognition. And I think as a researcher, we are very often not aware of this life world and the differences. And in the life world, the validity goes by checking with your family, with your friends. You do not consult the scientific literature. It does not count for you. If your friends tell you homeopathy is good for you, you go and you use homeopathy. And this is part of the experience of the life world. So just another quick run through the new media. The internet has enabled mass access, availability of information. It certainly has diluted the cognitive authority of science, because now there are many more sources, and even if people are aware that not all sources are equally trustworthy, nevertheless science has lost its former very strong authority. And then there are also other consequences, like having more expectations now through the internet. Everything you can buy, eBay, etc. So you also buy science and scientific information through the internet. So there is a shift in the place of science in society. And then I come to the power of visualization, which I find is one of the new tools that science is providing for communicating with the public. And I think it can help us to overcome the divide between nature and what is created by us humans. It is able to reduce the distance, and it resonates with the other media that we are aware of. I think we all remember this one picture of the planet Earth that was sent around, made in outer space, and it's this power of visualization that I think science can use. This is just a way of how perhaps nature and artifact and the fear of intervention and manipulation can be overcome, but I agree that it can be debated. Another example is by Sarah Franklin. She is looking at the large acceptance that assisted reproductive technologies have found by large. There are now 5 million babies in the world that have been born following such a technology. And the visual logic of this, there are now apps in which you can follow it. One of the questions that I have to you is when you say that people are not using it. I think apps are a way of bridging it. And this is one of the possibilities that you can do embryo watching. And this is a way of bringing science onto your phone, and it's a way of making a visual impression and conveying what we can do, making technology of biology and biology as a technology. So another aspect is the citizen science movement. And by this, a movement is meant to involve more citizens into the process of research itself. So not just giving them information, having them in as co-authors of your research process. Now, this presupposes that they know how to use not only the internet, but they know how to use a computer. But these people exist. And they are laypersons, and they are willing to spend part of their time with it. Folded is a very famous example of a protein, form of a protein folding, which was given to a lay community to help us find an answer. And they came up where the specialists have been grabbing. Of course, astronomy has a long history of amateur astronomers, and galaxies zoo is just one of them. Phytoplankton, fishermen who are helping to study phytoplankton, etc., etc. And one possible opening that I am pretty sure is coming, whether we like it or not, are big data. Big data in the medical field of putting up your DNA, your cells, your tissues, etc., as part of a data-intensive infrastructure. This raises a number of problems: who owns what, issues of privacy, etc. But at the same time, I think there is an opportunity to involve citizens in this big data infrastructures and to make them partners in a true research partnership. So, citizen science, new media, big data as an opportunity, training through research in schools are possible opportunities that we may use. The annuario, and I end with this, my congratulations. Again, I think you are showing, you are holding up a mirror to Italian society, many details. I think you are on a way also to redefine the public value of science. Science is a cultural activity, but in particular, in a country like Italy, where recently your Court of Conti was claiming that the beni culturali have to be part of your heritage. You have this tremendous cultural heritage here. And I think science should become the contemporary